Welcome everyone. My name's Councillor Denise Fox and I'm the chair of this committee. We have one apology, which is Mark Jones, Councillor Mark Jones. We have officers and councillor in front. Can I ask you to introduce yourselves, please, for the guests that are here today?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Councillor Kate MacDonald and the Executive Member for Finance and Resources. And thank you for giving us an opportunity to come and talk to you today.
Thank you.
Eugene Walker, Executive Director of Resources.
And Brian Keyworth, Director of Finance and Commercial Services.
David Phillips, Head of Strategic Finance.
Tim Hardy, Head of Commercial Business Development.
Thank you very much. Item 3, we don't have any exclusion of public or press today. Correct? Thank you. Item 4, do we have any declarations of interest from members of the board? No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you. Item 5, can I ask the committee to approve as a correct record of the meetings on the 4th of November? Yes, agreed, thank you. Do we have any matters arising from those minutes? No, thank you. Can we approve the minutes on the 2nd of December? Recalling? Yeah, thank you, agreed. And do we have any matters arising from them? No, thank you. Now we move to item 6, which is public questions, and I have been informed that Alistair would like to ask some questions. Would you like to ask your questions, Alistair?
All right, thanks. My name's Alistair Tice. I've been here before. I'm a member of the Socialist Party and I'm speaking on behalf of Trade Unions and Socialist Coalition. I do declare an interest. I've been campaigning against council cuts for the last 10, 15 years. Been to several council budget setting meetings or pre-meetings and argued the case for the council to defy the government, set no-cuts budgets using reserves and borrowing powers, to be repeatedly told that there wasn't the money in reserves to do that, and in any case it would be illegal. So my questions to you today revolve around trying to understand more the budget that you're scrutinising today for next year, but also in connection with such an approach that I've just outlined. So first of all, the budget refers to £52.7 million savings schemes, which is a huge number of cuts. I think probably the biggest single year cut Sheffield City Council's made since 2010 was possibly 60 million, but 2 or 3 times 50 million. So it's a huge number of cuts on top of those that have already taken place. But at the time of writing this question, it did not specify what those cuts were. Further reading of all this lot, which I think you'll all agree is not easy, perhaps sheds a bit more light information on that question. I see that there's a reference to 28.6 million service effectiveness, which sounds to me like management speak for cuts or efficiency savings. How they can be found without massive cuts to services after 12 years of cuts and efficiency savings, I don't know. And staff costs being cut by 13.6 million, with voluntary and redundancy and early retirement being proposed for something like 150 full-time equivalents. So my question in relation to that is, how can those cuts be made without massive cuts in services and impact on the people of Sheffield? I think some of which is highlighted in the equality impact assessment, which I've only just got to start reading this morning. So that's my first question. My second question is around the question of reserves. The budget refers to proposed use of £70 million worth of reserves, 30 million to balance this existing year's budget, which is running with a shortfall of over 30 million at the moment, according to your figures, and a use of another 40 million to balance next year's proposed budget. And later on in the document, it says, well, the Council is likely to exhaust most of its available reserves by the 31st of March 2023. Therefore, a review of service delivery to identify significant savings is essential, and then points to libraries, early intervention and hardship support. So in terms of the libraries, is what's going to be reviewed. The number of libraries that are run by volunteers rather than council staff is cutting of council librarians, jobs being reviewed. In terms of early intervention, how can you cut early intervention without it costing more further down the line in terms of children's services and adult social services? And hardship support, you're proposing in this budget to slightly increase it this year, recognising the increased hardship as a result of the pandemic and austerity policies, yet you're going to review hardship support, and these reviews are demanding cost savings, and you're warning that if those cost savings are not made, then, you know, 2023 you're in real trouble. In fact, it says in the document, if these cuts are not made after the reviews, quote, we will have to use remaining reserves in a risky and unsustainable manner, and in such a way implying that perhaps the S151 officer wouldn't be able to sign them off because they are so risky and unsustainable. So my questions on reserves are, having been told repeatedly in previous years that you only have the minimum amount of unearmarked usable reserves available, and the figure for this year, off-quoted, including by Eugene in correspondence to one of my colleagues, was the 12.9 million figure, yet suddenly 70 million becomes available. Reading on further, I see that 103.9 million unearmarked usable reserves is referred to. How can you have 100 million unearmarked usable reserves, of which you've dipped into? So how much more of that can you dip into? Over the past years, when I and others have been saying you should use reserves to not carry out the cuts and being told they aren't there, we can't do it, it's not legal, they have been there, haven't they? You've just unearmarked reserves and said, now we'll use those reserves, not to not make cuts, but to carry out a budget that is making cuts. And you're saying those reserves are going to run out. How much more reserves are there? How much will you consider for the following year?
Thank you, Alistair.
I've got one more question.
Yeah.
Okay. And in view of the lack of information about the 52.7 million cuts and the existence of the 70 million plus reserves, wasn't the Council's budget consultation a purely tick box exercise to which the public could not really make any informed comment because they didn't have the necessary financial information available at that time?
Thank you, Alistair. Could you switch your mic off now, please? Thank you. We've got quite a few questions in there. Would anybody like to start? Councillor MacDonald.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Tice. We have actually got a subset of your questions which you submitted in advance, so those are the ones which I'm going to respond to. You asked a lot of other questions in terms of your, I'll call it an introduction. So if there are any that are outstanding at the end of my response, feel free to put them in writing and send them to us. Because as you can imagine, you just came up with a whole list of new questions as well, which I'm sure I could get officers to respond to, but I'm going to actually respond to your written questions. Thank you. A full list of all £52.7 million of saving schemes is shown in the appendix, and I do appreciate that you didn't have that full information when you submitted your questions. It's Appendix 2 to the budget book. And please note that although we're having to reduce the amount we'd like to spend to meet the pressures on services, it doesn't mean that expenditure is being cut. In fact, if you look at Table 7, it shows that the council's spending actually rises from 420 million to 440 million. However, given upwards pressures on spending of 81.7 million, as shown in Appendix 1, we've had to reduce our budgets by 51.3 million to limit the spending increase to what we can afford. Additionally, in a number of places, including Appendix 2, there's a link to the Council's budget implementation plans. So, for short, they're known as BIPs, B-I-P-S, an acronym. And these BIPs, the details, set out the savings proposals. The BIPs numbers are quoted in Appendix 2 to make them easier to find in the linked Excel document. So, for somebody such as you who's really interested in the detail, you can find that. Moving on to question 2. About reserves. So we've identified that £70 million of reserves are available altogether. The Council has a number of reserves which are generally amounts set aside to meet known future commitments. Of these reserves, only 12.9 million is not set aside for specific items. That is, these reserves are unearmarked. However, every year, the Council reviews all its reserves to see if they're all still needed, or indeed if they require increasing as new commitments emerge, and then can use any it does not need. So it's not the same for over a period of time. It is actually something that does change year on year. This year, improvements in items such as the financial position of the South Yorkshire Pension Fund, into which we pay towards our employees' pensions, as all employers have to, means that the Council can reduce some of its reserves, which we put aside to meet those commitments. In a more risky manner, obviously, if the Council had used these reserves in earlier years in a more risky manner, since we did not then know, for example, that the pension fund values would experience a sustained rise, then we could not use them now, and so consequently would have to make bigger savings this year. The Council can use its available reserves to smooth spending between years to give it time to deliver savings, but is legally required by central government to set a balanced revenue budget each year. Reserves, once they're spent, are gone forever. Moving on to question 3. We published the state of the Council's finances in both the draft financial statements and the medium-term financial analysis that went to Executive in October. And I've been very clear as well about the state of our finances. It's not a surprise that we get to this point. We've been monitoring it and trying to address it all year. So I've spoken public about it. I've done radio interviews about it, and we've had discussions at council meeting. So it has been publicly known. A link to our medium-term financial strategy was also included in the public consultation to make sure that people had simple route to it. Our budget monitoring information has also made both local, national trade and non-trade press. There's a wider point we could make about the consultation, and we've been asking people about their priorities and so on. So we've got some information which is in the budget documentation to back up the decisions, to inform the decisions that we've made. We also spoke to a number of stakeholder groups, and we were very honest about the nature of the challenges that we're facing. And in fact, most of the people that we spoke to, in fact, all the people we spoke to in the stakeholder groups were very supportive because they know what we're doing to try and address the situation. So thank you very much for your questions. If there's any that I haven't asked because I didn't have them in advance, feel free to write and we'll address those as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor MacDonald. Does any officer want to add anything? Eugene?
Yeah, thank you. I think your question actually kind of illustrates really well the dilemmas that we, and I mean officers and members, all face. None of us likes the position we've been placed in by the money we've got from government, and it gets harder every year. Absolutely right. And I think picking up on the point on reserves, because it's really important from the point of our financial sustainability. I think Kate said it, but just to reinforce, You know, we do have a low level, 12 million of general reserves. We haven't magically unearmarked things, produced them from nowhere. It's a thorough review of what our circumstances are, and fortunately in recent years the pension fund has massively improved compared to what it was. It was a massive burden a few years, and that and some other things have allowed us to use more reserves. If we had used those reserves in previous years, we would have been by now be in an even more difficult position than we already are. And we've spent a long time trying to maintain in this council a prudent financial position, as well as being really clear about us trying to do our best to minimise the impact of the reductions on the citizens and communities in Sheffield. And I think that's been absolutely the right approach. If you look at authorities who haven't faced up to the financial realities they're faced by governments, that's when they get into difficulty. And looking to the future, and back to my role as Section 151 officer, we really need to work with all members to kind of keep that approach, because the alternative is not to set a illegal budget. That the only thing that leads to, and I've said this before, is that I and members will be replaced by a commissioner imposed by Whitehall, and they will implement cuts and reductions across the council without any regard to local political or community feeling, and that is a worse outcome, I think, than all of us in this chamber doing our best to work out between us what is the least worst option of the very difficult hand we've been placed. And I think that's, I've said that before, but I think we're even further down the line really in terms of the difficulty of that position. But I definitely think we're all the least worst way of dealing with that, if I can put it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. And thank you, Alistair, for coming today and bringing your questions. Okay. Item 7, the revenue budget report from the directors. Who would like to introduce this? Ryan?
Thanks, Chair. So, a report in two parts. First of all, the revenue budget, and then I'm going to ask, perhaps take questions on that if that's all right with you, Chair, and then I'll ask Tim Hardy to talk about the capital budget, and then perhaps further questions again if that's okay with you. So, the revenue budget for 22-23 is based on the medium-term financial analysis that we've spoken about, which was approved by the executive in October 21. I think it's fair to say, and you've heard comments to this effect, that this is the most challenging budget process that the council's had to deal with, certainly for a long time, if not ever. And part of the reason for that is this year's current financial position. We are currently forecasting an overspend of around £30 million, which is the largest by some margin for again, a very long time, if not ever, at this council. And those overspends, or the issues that have contributed to that overspend, are largely within our two social care areas, so adults and children's, and as a result, they're very, very difficult to manage, and they are ongoing in nature. They're not one-off issues that are resulting in an overspend. The medium-term financial analysis report sets out a budget gap for this year starting at almost £100 million. That breaks down in round numbers into three. 20 million relating to the ending of one-off government grant to support the council during the pandemic, like a lot of councils had. At that time, around 40 million we thought was the ongoing impact of the in-year position, so social care overspends, and about £40 million relating to pressures as we go into 2022-23. A number of £40 million for a future year pressure is not uncommon and not unusual for us to deal with. The things that made this an unprecedented budget process is the 20 million drop-off of government grants, which we used to balance the 21-22 budget when we set it, and the ongoing impact of the overspend in this year. So, we identified, as is set out in some detail in the report, £52.7 million worth of savings. About £18 million of costs come to an end as a result of the pandemic starting to end. For example, a lower subsidy required by Sheffield City Trust to keep the city's leisure facilities going, and a recovery in fees and charges, for example, parking. The government spending review also gave us a net increase above our expectations of about £13 million. But that resulted in a gap at the end of the day of about £14.5 million, and that's the amount of reserves that we're having to use to balance the budget for 22-23. So we've not managed to set a balanced budget without using reserves to achieve that position. The report also proposes a council tax increase of 2.99%. That's as high as we're allowed to make without a referendum. That assumes an ultimate collection of about 99% of council tax and about 95.5% of that within the first year. That's a return to pre-pandemic assumptions. So we're making an assumption that we collect council tax broadly in line with how we used to collect it. That's been borne out in recent months, so it's not a difficult assumption to make. But just to make it clear, we're assuming that we're going to collect as we used to. We've had some conversations already earlier in this meeting about reserves. We have a total of about £260 million of reserves. Some of that money simply isn't ours. We're holding it on. We're holding on to it. For example, PFI credits. Government pays us PFI credits to a different time profile than we pay them out. So we hold those in a reserve. Some reserves are held for timing reasons to smooth out the impact of costs. For example, the major sporting facilities debt repayments. The payments that we make out are not smooth. The reserve that we have in place effectively smooths that out until the end of that debt in 2024. And about 150 million of those reserves were held essentially to manage risk. And it's that risk reserve that we've really looked at very closely and very carefully as part of setting this budget. That risk reserve includes the pensions that Eugene spoke about a few minutes ago. It also includes an insurance reserve, reserves against unexpected highways works and so on. So we've decided, following that review, that about 70 million of those reserves is available for use. A few years ago, we were talking about a number of about 35 million, as I remember, presenting a budget to council a couple of years ago. So again, we've continued to review. The pension fund has continued to perform well, and we can take a different look at some of those reserves. So of that 70 million, we think about 30 million will be needed to deal with the overspending 21-22, 15 to balance next year. It's the 14.5 I spoke about a couple of minutes ago. And that leaves us 25 million left. Now, as part of this budget, we're asking the organisation to deliver £52.7 million of savings. That is hard to do at the risk of stating something that's potentially quite obvious. There are timing risks associated with those savings. In other words, they won't all be delivered by the 1st of April. Some of them might take longer than that, and some of them might take longer than we currently plan them to take. There'll be delivery risks associated with those savings. It might not be possible to deliver all of them. So we have set aside that remaining 25 million to manage the risk of delivering those savings. That means it's really important, in fact it's critical, that the council stays within the budget that we set this year. And we've added, not within the version of the report that's before this committee today, but for the version of the report that's going to the cooperative executive next week, a specific recommendation that requires executive directors and directors working with relevant members to fully mitigate any overspends that arise during the year. We can't arrive at this point next year with a significant overspend. We simply won't have the reserves to manage it. Achieving those sort of savings, as we've talked about, is far from easy. In corporate services like my own, in finance and commercial services like HR, legal, communications and so on, all of those services are seeing the cash that they have to spend next year reduce from the cash they had to spend this year. So that's a cut. That reduces capacity and reduces the capacity of our corporate services to support the rest of the organisation. In our place portfolio, effectively the services there have a cash standstill position. In other words, the cash they have to spend next year is the same as the cash they have to spend this year. That requires those services to look at their costs, to look at fees and charges, to look at the office accommodation we use, and critically to make progress on things like the leisure strategy that was approved by the cooperative executive late last year. The objective of that strategy is to see long-term costs lower than they are today, and we need to start making progress on that. Within our social care services, What we're doing here is setting a budget for next year that is the same, roughly, as the amount that will be spent this year. So not the budget for this year, but the amount that's spent this year. This year's budget for social care is being overspent by about £30 million. The budget for next year bakes that overspend in, but requires those services to make significant savings to achieve effectively what is a standstill position based on this year's actuals. They're going to need to do some fairly significant work, very difficult work, in reviewing some high-cost care placements that arose during the pandemic as we did our best to look after people and keep them safe. We need to reset some of our home care costs back towards something more like the pre-pandemic levels. We need, in some cases, to build our own capacity to address market failure when it comes to providing very high needs placements for children, for example. We see an increasing number of children with high needs who need currently very expensive places. It's not uncommon now to see places for children costing £10,000 a week. You can imagine you don't need many children with those level of needs at that level of cost to cause a real budget problem for the council. And there's an opportunity for us as a council to provide more of those sort of places ourselves and to put more of the control of those costs in our own hands. So what I've said about the impact on the budget, and there's a diagram in the report that shows how the council has prioritised support for social care over the last 10 years. And in fact, you can probably draw the graph further back into history, and you'd see the same picture. So the council has consistently supported our social care services as they seek to look after those who need it most in the city. And as I said, the budget for next year for social care is around 30 million higher than the budget for the current year. And that continues the pattern of previous years. I think our social care spend over the last 10 years has gone up by 7 or 8% per year, every year. So significantly above inflation and reflecting the importance the organisation has placed on protecting those key services. I just want to touch on the use of reserves. Using £15 million, £14.5 million of reserves is certainly not done lightly. That does mean we need to take further action over and above that which is in the budget, because we need to arrive at this point next year with a lower cost base. We are planning a series of strategic reviews to take a look across the council at how we deliver some of our services. Some of those were mentioned in questions earlier. The intention behind the review, though, is to essentially examine how we can maintain or improve services while saving money. Now, that might mean doing things differently. In some cases, that might be working in a more joined-up way. We still deliver some of our services and support to people in a way that's not joined up. So different services deliver slightly different services to the same people, but done in very different ways. So there's an opportunity there to join them up. And it might, in other cases, mean that we look at how we deliver those services and whether we continue as a council to deliver them, or we deliver them in a different way. I'll use the example of libraries because it's an example that we've heard already today, and something that we did in the past, where we moved some libraries to be volunteer-led or volunteer-run. There's still an investment from the council in doing that, but it's a lower investment and is a way of continuing to provide those services to communities at a lower cost to the council taxpayer. Chair, I'm going to stop there and invite questions if I can without delving into the minutiae of the report.
Thank you, Eugene. Councillor Argencio has just indicated first, and then it's Councillor Otten. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report and all the work that's gone into it, and all the presentations that you've done to groups and of councillors. It's been months, isn't it, that we've been working on this. My question is about, obviously, the biggest pressure on our budget is the social care side of it. So my question is, I have a few questions, but they're all linked. Why is there such a huge overspend again? Obviously, it is a trend, but why are we overspending? Why cannot we budget precisely for it? How does it compare to other cities, other core cities in particular, and what are they doing differently from us? I know that we are really valuing our kind of contribution to adult social care as an authority because we want to protect the most vulnerable. But what are the core cities doing, and what positions are they in, and what are we doing to ensure our resilience in the face of this trend of rising cost of social care, to ensure that we can, in the future, in the long term, medium and long term, support the most vulnerable, but also avoiding cutting other services. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to answer? Ryan?
Thanks, Chair. I think I'll say a few words and then perhaps Councillor MacDonald. Budgeting for the social care services is fiendishly complicated. You're right, though. We have overspent fairly regularly over a reasonably long period of time. It's complicated because what you have is a very high cost of looking after, in some cases, a single child or single older person, and predicting the numbers that we're going to have to look after and the exact mix of complexity and so on is not easy to do. We need to continue to get better at it, though. I'll be quite honest. And so there's no silver bullet here. Core cities, how do we compare? We are, to a certain extent, an outlier. Other core cities are not seeing the level of pressures that we are. Some are seeing pressures in the children's services, which aren't a million miles away from us. Some are seeing pressures in their adult services that aren't a million miles away from us, but very few, if any, are seeing pressures in both their social care services. So we've got, I'm afraid, a rather unfortunate combination of challenges in both services. We're doing a huge amount of work with the two services concerned, and the services themselves are driving this work. So within our adult social care service, the director there, working with the executive member, has a significant change programme in progress, which is designed to reshape the way that service is provided, make sure that we're providing the care we need to provide, but really challenging some of the ways in which it's done, and with a clear objective to reduce the cost of that care and get better value for money. In our children's services, it's some of the things I spoke about. We are looking at how we can have more of our own provision to manage the risk of some of those higher costs. For example, and Councillor MacDonald might want to say something about this. The city of Glasgow, one of the core cities, has had a policy decision around keeping more of its children, in fact all of its children, within its city boundaries. One of the issues we face is when we're unable to find capacity to look after some of our children within the city, and then we're faced by sending them out of the city to be looked after. That is both really not good for the child and really, really expensive for the council. So what we need to try and do is ever more work to keep more of our children at home where it's safe to keep them at home, and as close to that position as we possibly can. And the fewer children we send out of city, the better. So there's a huge amount of work going on with the director of that service and her team to look at different ways of doing that, to improve our fostering performance and so on. All of which we've done a lot on in recent years, but it's an ongoing situation. And that really speaks to your question about resilience. It's the same thing. The more we can do in city and at the earlier stages of intervention, the better, really. And that's how we can best avoid having to cut other services to support those vital services. It doesn't get away from the fact, though, that the government funding that we have just really doesn't recognise the cost of providing adults and particularly, if I'm honest, children's social services. The health and social care levy that was announced last year, we won't see any benefits of that for at least 3 years, if at all, to be honest, because it relies on the NHS giving up money to be transferred to local government. We wait to see to the extent that happens in 3 years' time. And at the moment, the changes in the charging regime for adults, I've frankly got my fingers crossed it doesn't cost us money, that it's neutral to us. You probably notice in the spending review and a lot of government announcements, actually, that children's social care isn't mentioned. There's little, if any, recognition, central government-wise, that looking after children who really do need it, and we don't do it lightly by any stretch, is very expensive to do if you want to do it properly. And you know, we've got a good Ofsted rating. That's not come lightly either. But there's little recognition of that from government. Kate, do you want to?
Thank you, Councillor MacDonald.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Argencio. Ryan's answered some of the sort of technical stuff about recovery plan, monitoring, all of the sort of business as usual, not business as usual, but the business stuff. What I'd like to add to that is I'd like to sort of just respond in terms of the resilience question, if you don't mind. First of all, we're taking a sort of a whole system approach to the social care. And if I give you two examples, one which is adult services and the other which is children's services, because they're obviously quite different. So, for example, around adult social care, we're working very closely with other partners, particularly the health service, and there's a lot of effort now going on to much better integration of health and social care, which will be to the benefit of people of Sheffield, and also should mean much better use of our resources jointly. We've also, as far as children's services are concerned, we've taken a whole council approach to looking at some of the other solutions to the needs of children and young people. So, for example, looking at accommodation needs of care leavers. So housing services have done a lot of work around that as well. So it's not just thinking about the same solutions, it's actually being innovative and working as a whole council and working with our partners as well. But I'm sure you would agree with me that the best solution to having resilient services, it would be for the government to come up with fair funding and a sustainable funding solution for social care in general, and we're still waiting for that, and that would make the biggest difference, I think, in terms of resilience of social care services and funding for those. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to come back in? Yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly. So are we confident that we have budgeted correctly for next year? I know that there are things that cannot be predicted, but you said that we've budgeted for spending 30 million more on social care next year. Is that enough to cover any kind of contingency where, you know, we may get a few placements that are super expensive?
Who would like to answer? Ryan?
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. I suppose two things I'd say. We try to budget sensibly. We try not to budget excessively prudently because it doesn't help to do that. We are keeping an incredibly close eye on next year's costs. We wouldn't in a normal year start looking at next year's costs until we were into next year. We've already started looking. We are identifying some potential issues, but this is about giving us time and space to deal with them as quickly as we possibly can. The other side of it is we simply can't afford any more. So the budget in its entirety that's it. Setting a budget that required even more reserves to provide us with lots of contingency, I don't think that would help us, to be quite honest. I think there's a need for us to manage within the budget we've got. That's going to require some difficult choices.
Thank you. Councillor Alton?
Sorry, can I just add to that, Chair?
Sorry.
If you don't mind. Yes. You'll recall that Laurie and Eugene and Ryan and I came round all the transitional committees this year talking about budget priorities and and the way we were going to be budgeting differently in the future. Well, this is going to be a big responsibility for the committees next year to stick to the budget. So it won't just be our responsibility, it will be your responsibility collectively. So enjoy. Thank you. Councillor Otten.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for bringing this report to us and for all the work that's gone into it. I just want to dive, if I may, into some of the detail on one of the points, I think, to try and help us as members hopefully understand what's going on. So I've found the link on page 55 of the report to the BIPs, and I've got the BIPs open on my laptop in front of me. And I've picked the long-term support tab, which is one of the more significant areas, 140 million of gross spending, 57 million net spending, so it's more than 10% of the council's budget. I'm just trying to understand, I think, from this, what, in terms of long-term support, care and support, what the offer is, how the offer is changing from the council to the people using the service, because it's not very clear. If I go through the pressures, obviously it distinguishes inflation and demand pressures, but okay, E1 inflation, E2 demand, E3, E4 demand like pressures. Scroll down. Pay award, okay. E7 is inflation pressures again, same as E1. E8 is growth pressures again, same as E2. And the different figures, so I guess they're different pieces of that coming in. But, you know, without more detail on these line items, it's very hard to work out what sort of growth in demand we're talking about in each case, and how, you know, and therefore to have a sense of how the offer is changing. Some of these pressures further on, funding for locality staffing, looks like it's an extra bit of service being put in, presumably because it's needed and this worked out this is the right way to do it. So that's, but is that kind of an extra service, or is it, you know, is it just keeping up with demand, or is it falling short of demand? It's not clear from that item what's happening. And similarly, I suppose in the savings, some of these savings things look actually quite good. I mean, there's a saving here. So there's a couple of items saying review of adjustments put in place during COVID. So if that's coming out, does that mean it's no longer that's coming out because it's no longer needed? And so there's 7.5 million there that we no longer need to spend because the COVID situation is going away. I've lost it now. There's one about using technology in the home for the people to control their own situation better, and it was saving money. Well, I thought, well, that's marvellous. It sounds like you're doing a good thing, and it's cheaper than the previous thing before. If that's the case, well done. But again, it means total savings doesn't really give us a picture of what might be taken away from people. So I don't know if you can help me out here. I'm sure it's very complex. The answer is very complex, but I don't know if you can help me out.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, what you're seeing is some of the knitting that goes into the budget process there. So the various inflation numbers relate to different parts of different services and so on. Just in terms of the savings you've picked out, actually, the ones you've talked about there, you're describing the adult social care transformation programme that the director and Councillor Linda Salmon are working very closely on to deliver. And some of that is about using things like technology to provide the same or better service at lower cost. Some of it is about reviewing some of those very high cost care packages that we put in place during the pandemic to see whether they are still required. That's a hard thing to do. You're potentially saying to somebody, actually that really expensive home care package you've got would now be better provided in a care home. And that's a horrible conversation to have with somebody. But it's quite possible that, you know, you can spend £3,000 or £4,000 a week on somebody's home care package to provide what is fundamentally a care home in somebody's house. And at the time we put those things in place, well, almost 2 years ago now, that was the best thing to do for the person, because care homes, you know, weren't somewhere we really wanted to be sending people in a pandemic. But now care homes are much safer and it can be the right thing to do. So what you've picked out there is some examples of how that service is trying to restructure itself to do two things really. One is reset itself post the pandemic, and secondly take advantages of things like technology and the way things are developing to allow people to be more independent in their own home without too much help from us. I'm not sure the budget report or the process is the right way to get an overview of that. And I don't know if Councillor McDonald wants to comment perhaps on that side of it.
We're just about to publish a adult social care strategy, and that's where that sort of discussion would be much better informed, to be honest, Councillor Rotten, because it's very difficult to get an overall picture from the tiny little bits which don't even form the full jigsaw. You talked about knitting. Mine was actually about bits of a jigsaw. So looking at these sorts of this sort of data isn't going to give you a picture of a service or what's changing in it either, because, you know, some things will be moving in different directions. And in fact, it'd have got changes anyway, even if it wasn't for the particular budget situation that we're in at the moment. So if you want an overall picture, I think you need to look at some of the more strategic documents, including the forthcoming adult social care strategy. And obviously, I'm sure they'd welcome your scrutiny of that.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I don't know if short of a good overall picture, you can say whether, you know, we're offering less service to more people and therefore more service overall, or the same service to more people, or what, you know, what driven by the budget situation is the effect on service overall and to your typical service user.
Thank you. Is that just a comment? Does it need...
Well, I mean, it's a question if there's somebody can answer it. I mean, if not, then it's a comment.
I'm sorry, Chair, through you, I do not have a picture of a typical service user, and that's the issue about social care, both adult and children's social care. We still have the ability to be able to respond to people's needs with a whole range of services and interventions and so on. There's nothing actually been taken off the table, if that's what you're asking. In fact, there are changes. I talked as well about, for example, making it easier for young people leaving care to get new accommodation and so on. Is that an enhancement of service? I would say it is, alongside the fact it would save us quite a lot of money as well. So it's not as simple as actually saying that's an addition, actually, to be honest. Having additional flats and so on in the community. And in fact, also enhanced access to some of the of technology and so on as well. People will still be able to have access to domiciliary care and still have access to residential care. And we're looking to use all our services in a really flexible way and responding to people's needs on an individual basis. That's why I find it quite difficult to overgeneralise about a typical service user. But thank you for your question. Anyway.
Thank you. No, yeah, I appreciate the complexity of the topic. I do hope that the budget information can be presented in a way that does give more information in terms of the line items. But thank you for that. I did have another question, but maybe I should let other people have a go because we're limited time.
Thank you, Councillor Otten. Now bring in Councillor Aries and come back to you if we've time.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the presentation and the report that we have here today. Still sticking with the adult social care theme, and I guess it's a primarily question for Councillor MacDonald, but also to the officers. And it's regarding the specifically to the Workforce Retention and Recruitment Fund that was announced by government in two tranches. One was in autumn, which I believe was for a total of 300 million, and then a second announcement of the continuation, sorry, 300 million to the end of this financial year, and then a further amount announced in December for the next three financial years. And my understanding is, from looking at the government's website, that Sheffield City Council was allocated 1.831 million of the initial 300 million share. I'm just trying to, and I have put these questions to the director, but I just wonder whether you could, there's any guidance that you could give as to how that fund, well, whether we have utilised all of the funding for the current financial year, and how that is because I can't see it actually, the lines in the mammoth amount of budget papers that we have, and other people have commented that it's quite a track to wade through. So how has that money, that initial funding, initially to ease winter pressures, but specifically for workforce retention recruitment, to the 31st of March, and do we have figures for the forthcoming 3 years for the remainder of the announcement that was made in December. And also, I suppose it's more of a service issue, but Councillor MacDonald might want to make a comment on how are we, or what can we do, and how are we ensuring that the funding that was intended for is actually reaching frontline social care workers within the adult social care sector. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ryan?
Well, I'm going to come in there because Councillor Ayres asked the same question at Shadow Cabinet last week, and I dodged it slightly by referring to the Director, which she's doing, but making some general comments as well, and I'll start off with some of those. He's right, the government has made a series of extra funds available for social care, but very much as Ryan said in his presentation earlier, those are for new things. So the point I made last week was the government's been quite good at coming up with some new money now, but that doesn't make up for the 10 years between 2010 and 2020 when they were steadily cutting our funding every single year. So we're battling with a legacy of 10 years of budget reductions still now. And the new funding that's coming in social care is very much to fund new activities. So it's around equalising fees between the fees that we pay where we negotiate because we block by lower rates than people do privately. That will just push fees up, and we're not sure, as Ryan said earlier, whether we will be funding for that. We've got to cope with it with the introduction of the 85k cap and that sort of thing. There's an extra fund for training for social workers, which is really welcome, but again, it's a new responsibility that's funded. It doesn't fund the initial bit. In terms of being slightly more specific, in terms of the money come in, wherever possible, we've spent all government grant funding that's come in this year, and I have a spreadsheet of over 100 lines of different government grants that have come in this year. We spend those wherever possible. Where we can't necessarily get them all spent this year, and given that some of them come in at almost no notice, that can be difficult. Where we can, we carry them forward and use them in next year's budget. So we're trying to use the government funding as much as we can. Government tends to hand us specific funding, so it very much has to go to the areas that it's intended for. So we always push for as much flexibility as possible in our budgets from government funding, but don't always get that. So we will have spent a chunk of it this year, and we will be planning to spend the rest of it over the next 3 years. It doesn't dig us out of the hole, though, because it's new money for new things, not what we also need, which is money for all the things we're doing currently.
Thank you. Was that okay?
Donald wanted to answer the bit about how can we as a council ensure, because as a former cabinet member for this portfolio, how can we as a council ensure that that those funds are actually, because we engage quite a number of providers, don't we? How can we ensure that those funds are actually diverted to frontline care workers?
Thanks, Steve. I think you're raising an important point. Obviously, a lot of our social care services, home care, etc., are provided through third-party arrangements, not in-house. And we have, for a number of years, been, as part of our commitment to the Foundation Living Wage and ethical procurement, been trying to raise that bar in services. And we've made some progress, but not as much as I know that we would have liked, due to the kind of scale and size of that challenge in the context of 10 years of reductions. We have made some progress, and you're right, passing that down the supply chain and making sure that is down to the frontline workers is very much what we've been trying to do. I think there's an important point in what you're saying as well about, you've mentioned about the future allocations of that workforce grant, and I have been involved in quite a few discussions in the last few months across Yorkshire and Humber with other authorities, doing some work with social care directors as well as directors of finance and chief execs. And it's fair to say that, this is the workforce issues are probably the hottest topic in social care. The grants that we've got, I don't think the problem is how can we spend the grants. You're right, there's a point about how we get them down the supply chain, but the amounts we've got are a drop in the ocean compared to the challenge. that all authorities have about the level of wages for what is a really important job. And post-pandemic, with supermarkets, Amazon, etc., coming into the market and paying, frankly, far higher wages, it has worsened the shortage of staff in that area, and as well as the impact of the pandemic itself. And the workforce grant they've given for future years everyone is convinced, is nowhere near sufficient to deal with that challenge. And it is a big question for government about, there are questions there about parity with the NHS, etc. Because quite often social care ends up being the poor cousin of NHS services, and certainly the staff do. So I don't think we have a full answer to the very good question you're raising. I think some of it's in our hands about how we manage our supply chain, but the bigger question is actually the quantum and scale and the reward that, frankly, society gives to people working in social care, actually.
Thank you.
The only additional comment I would make is that if you've not got enough money to actually achieve, or if the government's not making sufficient investment in social care to achieve our aspiration of foundation living wage and better, because I think social care staff do a fantastic job and they deserve to be appropriately rewarded for that. And we're not getting that sort of income from government to be able to meet that aspiration. However, as you will be aware, we're also looking at how we changing the way we procure adult social care in the future, and that will give us an opportunity, as far as possible, to make the most of the funding that we have available to get it to the place that we want to get it. But it won't solve the problem, which is basically that the adult social care is not appropriately funded to reward our staff appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Oakland?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all the hard work that's gone into preparing the budget. It can't have been, amongst many years of it not being an easy task, ever an easy task. It can't have been this time round. Have you got any idea? I think you were saying the final settlement was a bit better than you expected. Has the government given any indication about what future settlements might be? No, I didn't think they had, for going forward. I've usually heard officers say that we're not in the Premier League when it comes to the graph of doom. So I just wonder, an assessment of this graph of doom when every council is going to run out of money eventually. What your assessment might be. How are we doing in the local government world? Then I've got some questions, and given the scale of the problem, it's with some reluctance that I pick over some of the figures, but I'm going to. Page 52, you mention a risk about capital financing risk, 7.9 million, and I see why you've got that in there. I just wonder what the margin of that calculation is, and what are the upside and downsides, vulnerabilities that the council financial position has. There's also a mention about a saving for a customer experience programme, because the programme's no longer going ahead. And one of the things that particularly I get now is actually our customers, our citizens, having problems getting through to the council, the phone system. A lot of it to do, well, mainly I guess I'm putting it down to COVID and all the rest of it, but I begin to suspect it's worse than that. And amidst all this, what can we do to still improve the customer experience? It's not as good as I think we would like it to be. Page 98, one of the savings is in cleaning and catering and something else, 938,000. It's a handy saving, I'm sure, but I just wonder what's going to be, what the cleaning, catering and whatever the other bit service is going to look like. in the future. There's a mention of a depot strategy, and I just wonder who in finance is leading on the depot strategy and what is it trying to achieve. And I did this, Chair, on my on the screen, so I'm probably, and I can't remember, but somewhere I've put under borrowed and 3 question marks. Now I don't know whether that's under borrowed on the capital programme or that we're under borrowed and we could borrow more prudently. So I don't even know what my question there is, Chair, but I'm sure with all their collective expertise, the table can tell me what I was thinking about. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Ryan?
Right, so I'll start, perhaps not in the order you asked the questions, but I'll make sure we get them all. 1 year settlement is what we got. Interesting, you know, I've got my fingers crossed for a 3 or 4 year settlement because the spending review was 3 or 4 years, I think, when it was announced last year. But the local government settlement that fell out of that spending review was just a 1 year settlement, which is frustrating because it makes it difficult for us to plan. Where are we compared to others? We are still relatively financially strong, although if we don't get to these savings this year, we won't be. You know, other authorities are having similar conversations to this one without the reserves that we've got to deal with the issue in a proper way. You know, some councils had mass redundancy exercises as a result of the pandemic to get the costs down. We haven't had to do that. We've been able to take a more measured approach and ask for volunteers and so on. I'm going to ask Dave to talk about the capital financing point on page 52 in a minute. The customer experience programme, one of the strategic reviews we want to undertake this year is of customer service, customer experience. So it's a slightly technical saving, as in we've stopped a piece of work and we're probably going to start another one. The depot strategy that's referred to, that's another one of the strategic reviews that we're looking at. We have a number of depots around the city. The question is that the right number? Are they in the right place? There's a lot of work needed, backlog maintenance-wise, on our depots. So is there an opportunity to take a look at those, do them differently, and address some of the backlog maintenance that we've got? Savings on cleaning and catering. Yeah, that means that we will be looking at the cleaning provision that we've got, and also looking at the catering provision that we make available to staff and members within the council's buildings. Well, it'll certainly, the prices might go up, I suppose, is what I'm saying, Councillor Ortland, certainly for the catering. So, Dave, if I can ask you to talk about capital financing and also a little bit on Councillor Ortland's point on under-borrowing, if you can manage that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. I'll save the excitement of under-borrowing for last. Just on the capital financing point, the main cause of that is an increase in something called MRP, which is minimum revenue provision, which is a very complicated way of saying that we have to statutorily put aside funds for our borrowing every year. We charge sort of 2% of the borrowing levels. As properties have come on stream as part of the heart of the city, they attract minimum revenue provision a year actually after they're built. There's a lag in it. So that and various other bits and bobs has meant we've had to increase that budget. So the other question is one on under-borrowing that we get most years, normally from Councillor Curran, who's sadly not with us today because he always reads the Treasury strategy in great detail. I'll spend a little bit of time on this because it can cause a flurry of other questions. The council obviously has a long-term borrowing strategy and borrows every year for what it's doing. It also manages its cash positions, and there is a very important difference between its cash position and its revenue position, and it's a question we've had from Alistair in the past, so that's why I want to go over this. The council is relatively well off in cash terms, and that's in bold and underlined 3 times. Partly because just the way our budgets work, we tend to have to charge some things that we don't need cash for, and partly because the government in its wisdom thought the councils might run out of cash at the start of the COVID pandemic and bunged us a load of extra cash as well. unlike a private company that lives and dies by its cash position, we live and die by our revenue position, not our cash position. We can always get cash because we can go to something called the Public Works Loan Board, BWLB, another acronym, and borrow from them, as long as we can make the repayments all the time. But we are not, repeat, not allowed to borrow for our revenue budget. So we can't, again referring to a question that was asked earlier, statutorily borrow to fund revenue. Central government can. So people often say, why can't the council just borrow more? Because they see central government doing it all the time. It allows itself to do it, it does not allow us to do it. So we've got, although we've got a good cash position, that doesn't mean we've got a good revenue position, really important point. And our cash position means that we've not needed to borrow as much as we might otherwise do. We use our internal cash reserves to fund some of our capital spend rather than going out and borrowing. We can borrow for capital. We can't borrow for revenue, just in case that distinction is not clear. And that's what we mean by under borrowing. The reason we do that is that the cash that sits in our bank account gets 0.1% interest at the moment. It's like cash all you've got in your bank account, you get nothing for it. And we still get charged a very low, but a couple of percent when we go out and borrow. So we try to use our internal cash position reserves if we can do. Otherwise, we're spending £1.5 million a year of extra on every 100 million. We borrow extra borrowing. As another aside, because long-term borrowing rates are looking to move upwards, that might be something we actually do go out and borrow on and reduce our under borrowing. But for the past 7, 8, 9, 10 years, rates have just sat low, so we've not wanted to get more cash in by borrowing. That's what we mean by under borrowing. So it sounds a scary phrase, it's not. And it sounds like we'd magically have lots more money for our revenue budget if we went out and borrowed. We haven't. It's purely managing our cash and our capital position, not our revenue position. One final point, on capital, it'd be lovely to go out and just spend £1.5 billion on capital, but if we do that, we've got to pay the loans back, and that is a revenue charge, so that does, and we've got to pay the minimum revenue provision, for those of you awake through all of this earlier, and that's a revenue charge as well. So there are revenue consequences to capital that we have to fund. So we can borrow easily enough for capital, but we can't always afford, we've got to think about the revenue consequences as well. Sorry, it's a topic I'm quite enthusiastic on, so apologies for the long answer. And it's my last one before I retire, so I'm enjoying myself.
Well,
it's a good one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chair, not only answered the question, but reminded me why I was asking it in the first place. So I'm so grateful. I had caught one other actually. Shall I ask it?
Go for it.
All right. Pay pressure. Am I right in thinking you've moved the pay pressure back onto the individual directorate's budget? Is that it's page 53, this. 2 pay pressures, 2.5 million, a reduction in funds held corporately. This is because of a budget transfer to portfolios. Is that a measure of discipline for the portfolios or hopeful thinking?
Yeah, we tend to do both with pay pressures. We have both a cost of increments and a cost of living rise, and we've tended to ask portfolios to fund the cost of living rise, and we funded the pay increments, which is more a function of the corporate scheme. We've got an additional problem this year that the pay rises still haven't come through, so we've had to work through a number. And also, we were doing that when inflation was very, very low, and consequently pay increases were very, very low. So a 1% sort of ask from portfolios is much more reasonable than if the pay rise is much higher, which it may well be in 22-23. So that's why we've got that phrase in there.
So
yeah,
I certainly wish you
to
well.
be clear, the approach hasn't changed. The approach is the same this year as it has been in previous years. We've for some years now, I've split the burden, if you like, between the council and the individual service areas.
Thank you, Chair. And, wish you all the very best, Dave. I'm sure we all do. And I'm sorry to have maybe given you not your favourite question to answer for the last one, but thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Rooney?
Thank you, Chair. If somebody tells me what David's favourite
question is. I'll ask you now. So if you want to send me an email while I'm talking now, I'll ask you for it. It's a question about, I think Ryan said earlier that we're an outlier in terms of our financial situation because we've got pressures within both social care budgets. I remember a long time ago, there was a time when older people services used to cross-subsidise the rest, but that doesn't occur anymore. But you also said we're actually in a pretty reasonable financial situation, and on the face of it, those two things seem to be contradictory. I wondered if you could explain why they're not, please.
So we are an outlier in that we've got challenges in both our adults and children's services compared to other core cities. When I said we're in a relatively strong position, we're in a relatively strong position to deal with it, but it still needs dealing with. We have more reserves available, the 70 million that we've spoken about in the report and in this conversation. We have more reserves available to deal with these sort of challenges than others do, but they're only one-off reserves. They give us a bit of time, and they give us time to deal with the budget pressures we've got in a proper way, in a careful way, rather than having to make emergency cuts to services or get into the territory of very significant and stringent spending controls, the sort of things that might result in commissioners coming in. So the financial strength we've got through the careful work that we've done over the years to have a reasonable amount of reserves gives us time to deal with the position we find ourselves in now, where we've got significant cost and some demand pressures in our children's and adults' social services.
Could I come back? I mean, I understand what you were saying about the differences in terms of the issues that different authorities are facing, and also the similarities. But are there similarities or lessons to be learnt in the ways that they are dealing with their problems as opposed to the way that we're dealing with ours?
I'm sure there are, Councillor Rooney, and that's exactly the work that both the directors of adult health and social care and children and families are doing right now to deliver their budget savings. Some of that absolutely involves looking at things that other councils might have done that we can learn from, we can use. We spend a lot of money on our early intervention and prevention services at Sheffield. That gets us in some ways the Ofsted ratings that we have. We need to look at that and see if there are ways in which we can maintain that level of service but do it at lower cost, and that's one of the big reviews that we want to undertake this year. We'll certainly be looking at other authorities to see how they're doing that. And the same sort of thing applies in our adult services.
Just final small point. I don't think that you gave enough emphasis to the reviews that are taking place, because they're fundamental in many ways to the way that we're going to be delivering social care, particularly for children. I can't speak so much for the adult side because I haven't really been involved in that much, but in terms of the way that we deliver children's social care, they're fundamental, and I do think perhaps some more should have been said a little bit today or at some other stage to make it clear that that the importance of getting that right.
I think that's a fair comment, Councillor Rooney. We're at the really early stages of defining what that review looks like. And I know that there'll be opportunity for members to engage in that process as it goes on.
Thank you. Councillor Leroy.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for everything and the detail that we've got here. I'd one question about reserves and about the major sporting facilities. Last year's budget said that we were below 20 million for the major sporting facilities. We're actually up at well over 34 million, which is like a 75% increase. how confident are we going forward that this isn't going to continue to increase? Thank you.
So that reserve does two things. One, it deals with the timing of the expenditure we need to make on the major sporting facilities debt, and secondly, it will help us deal with the transition from Sheffield City Trust to whatever comes next. And actually, I think I've been in front of this committee before talking about that particular decision that was made last year. So it covers both of those things. What we're working very closely with Sheffield City Trust on now, ahead of a report that we expect to bring to Cooperative Executive in March, is a clear business plan and financial settlement that will see us to 2024, to the end of the current set of arrangements. As it stands right now, I think we're about right. What I know today, I'm reasonably happy. There's still some more work, a bit of detail to do with Sheffield City Trust, but I think we're about right.
In the budget, is it the real expected outcome?
Yeah, that reserve, plus what's in the budget, I think there's still a bit of a margin of error we're working through. I'm sure you'll understand, because the report isn't finished yet and the detailed conversations are still going on. But I'm not seeing anything at the moment that's causing me to think that reserve is inadequate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Dale?
Thank you, Chair. Just following on from what Councillor Roney said and Ryan in regards to our children and young people services and the review of early intervention and prevention work, I just would like to point out to anyone watching that our investment in early intervention and prevention isn't simply about getting a good at Ofsted. It actually safeguards our children and young people. So I'm glad to hear that if there is to be a review, that service will not be impacted negatively when it comes to quality of the work that we will be carrying out as a city.
I think I'd just add that when we talk about reviewing early intervention and prevention, we're not just talking about children's services either. We're talking about all of our early intervention and prevention activities, and that to a certain extent is entirely the point. It's that some of our services are delivered to the same people by a number of different aspects of the council's work, and there's an opportunity to take a look across that board. So yeah, I think exactly, thank you.
Thank you. That's all the questions on this part. Would you like to move on to Tim?
Yes, that's fine. So capital strategy and budget book you've got in the sort of second part of the pack. It follows on from the revenue position. So detailed in there, basically each year we need to set a 5-year capital budget. So the budget for next financial year is £302.7 million, and over the 5-year period, £821 million. SIP for guidance is also basically required us to take a longer-term look on our sort of capital infrastructure more generally. Links a bit to the points Ryan was making earlier on about things like looking at our corporate estate, things like our depots, for example. So SIP for now asks us to take a 30-year view of our capital investment. So within the actual report, you'll see detailed in the different sections that in addition to the 5-year capital programme, we've also got a 10-year investment pipeline. So these are projects, probably some have been talked about for some number of years, to be quite honest with you, which we've got in contemplation. We think those need to be addressed in the medium term. And then there's also a look forward for a 30-year period, more of a horizon scan of issues, policy developments and the like, which are likely to affect the direction of the city in the future, which may require a capital project or response of some degree. Section A2 basically sets out some of the more formal key facts around how we operate the capital programme and also the policy issues that we need to sort of formally adopt each financial year. Section A3 brings out some of the more, I suppose, tangible challenges and anticipated strategic decisions we're going to need to make next financial year. So it draws out primarily that the city centre strategy and the need to review our approach on a number of key assets, some of which belong to us and some of which don't, within the city centre in terms of bringing together that full city centre vision for the future. It also links into other areas where potentially we might need to fund that ourselves or make a contribution towards certain other elements which might then impinge upon that city centre strategy. So trying to come up with a combined view of of where the council puts its own resources and takes a strategic decision on those different areas. So basically, looking holistically at the city centre strategy, where we contribute in terms of housing growth, and in particular our view around the city centre becoming more of a hub for housing in the future, dealing with some of our questions around schools capacity and in particular special educational needs. So that's an area, again, Ryan's mentioned that already in the context of the revenue budget, that there's certain pressures developing where actually a capital response helps to actually mitigate against that revenue pressure. And then the wider corporate estate more generally, things like the depots, but also all of our core office bases really, and buildings like, for example, the town hall and across the road at the central library, for example. Basically looking at all of those. So Section A3 looks at how we stitch that together to try and come up with a compelling vision of really which order in which we tackle these buildings and ultimately coming up with a funding strategy for them as well, because our own resources aren't sufficient to deliver that vision. So it's partly about putting ourselves on the pitch in terms of the external funding we need to actually make those different projects happen, basically. Section A4 is a summary of our position in terms of climate change and sustainability, which has become a bigger part of our sort of thinking and strategic approach, building on the 10-point plan for climate action. And obviously, again, with capital projects, there's always an environmental consideration as to the best approach to taking that for that individual project. The section B onwards within the report basically details that the different priority areas. So the capital programme is broken down into a number of themes, which I'm sure you're familiar with from previous reports. So that details basically the projects that are in delivery now, the ones we've got in the 10-year pipeline, and some of that horizon scanning as well to come up with the full sort of overview of the programme for the coming financial year, the next 5 years. I think that probably, in terms of introducing the report, that covers the key points. So happy to take any questions that arise from that.
Anybody would like to ask any questions, members? Councillor Rooney?
Yeah, unfortunately I haven't read this section, so if it's in it, I do apologise. One is, you mentioned the climate situation, and one of the assets we have in the city is the heating that comes from the incinerator. And I'm just wondering if there's any plans to expand that. It may well be in here, so if it is, I apologise for that. And the other is, I mean, this is a huge problem, and it's capital investment in private sector homes, because they are we've got some control over the investment in our own stock, and we're doing what we can with the resources that we've been allocated to deal with some of those issues. But the private sector is another matter entirely. And I'm just wondering, I know I'm not expecting you to sit there and tell me, yeah, I've got the answer to that, but how far you've got in the thinking of trying to solve that problem, okay?
Who's going to answer that? Dave?
I think I am. So do you want me to talk about the gender network first? Because we have got...
Yeah. Sorry. Well, Tim can answer a bit of that. He picked up an important point about the district energy network and the waste to energy plan. I think, as Tim will explain, what we've got in the report here is very much the capital programme as it stands at the moment. What we're also doing a piece of work on is thinking about the investment pipeline that works up to that and the future schemes we might need to have. And you've picked an important example there in terms of climate investment and the energy network. And it also links to, there have obviously been recent announcements about potential levelling up funding. Yeah, well, or may not be, but there are questions on that, but there's also some opportunities. We're doing a lot of work as well with the city region to think about how we can access the funding that is coming through the city region. So there's some investment planning work going off behind what's approved here, which will come through to members next year to take wherever we can, seize the opportunity for some the grant funding that may be around in future. There are also other institutions currently being put in place, like the UK Investment Bank, which has a brief to either lend or grant money on climate type investments. So as well as what you've got here, there will be further work in the year on what other schemes might be here, because if you looked at this capital programme, it's not got the totality of what we might need to do in terms of capital spending in the next 3, 5 and 10 years. It's got a part version at the moment on the basis of what funding we've got in place now, and we're doing some more work about what might be possible to develop in future and exploit funding opportunities.
Can I, Chair?
Yeah.
Is it?
Can I just come in before you do, Councillor Ray? All I was going to say was to draw your attention to the 10-point plan, because there's quite a lot in there about what our intentions are for the future, both in terms of finding different sorts of finance and also the funding that we need to attract to do some of the really big programmes around our estate and our responsibility as city leaders around climate change and decarbonisation, etc. So that would be a much better document for you. It's not dealt with in a lot of detail in this, because this isn't about our long-term plans as a council. It's about how we're going to use, how we are using our capital at the moment.
I was just going to suggest that at some stage we need to make members aware of what the forward thinking is, not just what the present thinking is. And
Sorry, I
find
think
some
that was the point I
mechanism.
was making. Sorry to interrupt you, but I think that was the point I was making.
Yeah, it's just about, some mechanism for saying, yeah, we know what you're thinking, we know what the problems are, and these are what we're thinking in terms of potential solutions for the future. It would be helpful rather than end up dropping on our toes. And similarly, whatever discussions are taking place at the mayoral level, it might be helpful if we get a heads up as soon as possible about what's being discussed there, please.
Yeah, just about, absolutely. That's why I mentioned it. I was kind of prefacing what we might be bringing about. I've worked here long enough not to know not to drop things on your toes. It's all right. So it was a little bit of a kind of enticer for what is to come. Absolutely, that's what we intend.
It wasn't just my toes, it was the collective toes of my colleagues.
Councillor Lodge, did you want to come in at this point?
It's a comment, Chair. I'll wait if everybody's asked questions, if there's other questions.
Councillor Otten, you're next.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Thank you for this report. It's great to have a kind of 30-year capital strategy in front of us. Though looking through it, it kind of struck me that a lot of it is projects that have been completed or are underway, and then there's sections under each heading of what we expect the world to be like 30 years from now, and there's not so much getting from here to there, and except possibly pages 31, 32, where we're looking at projects to review in the next couple of years. So I don't know if there's more you can offer to me on how we get to where it is 30 years from now. I can quite happily comment on some of the projects on pages 31, 32. It's probably not the right place to do it, but seeing as I'm here, have you thought, it's great, for example, to see the Central Library, Graves Art Gallery in there. I know it's in there every year, and there's always, well, we're thinking about doing something in the future. I'm glad we're still thinking about it. The ambition seems to have increased to create a nationally significant cultural offer, which is great. I would have taken actually making progress on one of the previous plans, but if this can happen, it would be wonderful. I would suggest moving the library out of there, putting the library on the John Lewis site, and turning the whole thing into an art gallery. But that's just me. Equally, the Midland Station, I'm happy to see that there. Can we have a decent-sized taxi rank there? That's my main ask of that. Other than that, whatever else you've got to bring us to the next 30 years, do please share.
Well, I suppose that you touched on a fairly fundamental point, which is actually there's more ambition in the programme than there is actually funding to deliver all of those objectives. Part of the issue, though, is actually being articulate enough about actually what it is we want the city to do. So, for example, again, this references back to that section 80 around the city centre vision. Being very clear about what we want the Central Library and Graves Art Gallery to be actually makes it more viable to be able to actually obtain the funding to deliver that vision. And I think we possibly struggled as a city to sometimes pick ultimately what we want to do, what the absolute function we want of some of those core civic buildings in a way that's sufficiently detailed to actually get us to a point where we're then able to put in a compelling bid to central government. And that fundamentally is the issue. So you're right, that there is that 10-year look forward is actually a real challenge for the organisation, because we don't currently have the funding. We are seeing, though, the government is more willing to throw capital at us than, frankly, help out our revenue position. So no comment on that, other than things like levelling up funding, for example, Future High Streets Fund, those kind of initiatives. When you have a clear vision and view about what you want to achieve, it often unlocks the funding. Whereas if you, I suppose, less ambitious, actually, perversely, you then receive less funding. So that's kind of the game we're playing, to be perfectly honest with you.
Thanks, that's a great answer. Good luck.
Thank you. Councillor Rooney wants to come back in.
Yeah, sorry about this. This is another slightly obscure question. But it's in the context of trying to get a net zero by 2030 or whatever it is, and investment in housing. Do we know what the other social landlords in the city are planning in terms of investment in their stock? And if we do, where are we publicising it?
If I can, I'd just like to add something, because you raised an interesting point about the 30-year strategy, and I mean, Tim was telling you what the challenge is about kind of filling in the next 10 years, which is why I also referred to that investment pipeline work we're doing, because that is very much part of that. I think there's an interesting point to make on the 30-year. The 30-year, as Tim said, has been put in recently by SIP, for the professional body that I'm a member of, which sets a lot of standards in accounting terms. It's probably just worth highlighting to members that one of the reasons that's been put there, on top of the existing rules around prudential borrowing, which are about making sure that you've got enough money to pay for your capital investments, they've been put in because, and we've referred to this before here, there are a number of councils in the country that have gone further than they should have done in terms of the types of investments they've made in order to generate income. And that 30-year strategy is very much about demonstrating that you have a prudent long-term approach. So it's kind of put a framework on our capital strategy that, in a way, is not required from our point of view, because we've always taken a very clear and prudent approach, and the types of investments we've made in property have been in city. They've been things like Heart of the City, which are properly funded and properly risk managed, and are not causing a problem to our budget. So there's just an interesting little thing going off in terms of how the government and professional bodies are putting regulation on all authorities in order to deal with the impact of a few, and that's partly why the document looks a little bit odd with the 30-year horizon, and they're just probably worth explaining that. Sorry, to Councillor Rooney's question. Yeah, again, within the investment pipeline work, we've got quite a lot of work with Homes England going off, which again we will be bringing to members as soon as possible, which has started to kind of reset the relationship that we've got with not only Homes England, but how they interface then with social landlords in the city. Because I know you're referring to a kind of a question with a long tail about what level of building there is in the city from them alongside what we're doing, and that is very much part of a joint piece of work with Homes England, which is also engaging with those social landlords. That I think, if I can do a little bit more enticing, I think we will be bringing something back around that when further of that work has been done with Homes England.
Just last point, it's just that I mean, I don't know the exact number, but there are a significant number of, there's a significant amount of social housing in the city that isn't council run. I don't know what the numbers are, but they must also be planning, you would thought, some investment to get to reduce their carbon footprint. And I don't know what that is. Maybe that I don't need to know what that is. But I think we, in general terms, we ought to know what that is and what contribution they're making towards our citywide attempts to reach the net zero target.
Okay. Tim? Yeah.
So I think primarily that point really is a point around planning, isn't it? And actually that the planning policy we take for the developments within the city. So obviously what you're receiving here is quite a technical paper that's simply about our cash going out the door into capital programmes. But you're right, that broader infrastructure locks into a citywide network, which ultimately needs managing through the appropriate legislative drivers. And I think that's part of the role and I suppose ambition of the city. The city council should be actually acting as that sort of civic leader to actually broker that conversation. So I think it's not really a budgetary question, but I think you're right, it gets into that wider policy around longer term development.
It's just every now and again some of my thoughts don't quite fit into the neat boxes that they ought to, but it's just one of those things I thought I need to say at this time.
Thank you. Before I come in with comments, I've got a few questions that I would like to ask. In the foreword, it says that we've got, there's 50% of cuts now since 2010. Do we have a figure on that so that, the public listening can actually relate to that? Because when we just say using percentages, we don't exactly know. So it'd be interesting to know what the figures would be on that.
I think you just hit Dave's specialist subject.
It had increased to over 200 million at one stage. It's come down to a bit below 200 million now. I think it was up to sort of 225, and it's probably down to about 170, 180 now, because we have had, in the last 2 years, we've had quite a lot of more government funding, but very much the point I made earlier, that doesn't make up for the 200 million of funding we lost between 2010 and 2020. Clive Betts quoted a cumulative real terms figure of £3 billion since 2010 in a parliamentary debate the other night.
Thank you. That's interesting. Thank you. The next question is last. I'm looking at Councillor Levery because he was the one that said it. He said we have on this committee last year. He said it is a well-run council. Do you remember? And we all agreed at the time. And so can we say that this year is the major problems that we have in social care and things, is that having that impact on us? Can we still say that?
Can I respond first to that?
Absolutely.
To be honest, my opinion is that we've had these pressures on us as a council, and we've had COVID and so on as well. And to be honest, I think we wouldn't be able to cope with that level of pressure at all if we didn't have this history of being prudent with our reserves and actually picking up in terms of financial management very early on in the process. So I think it's our track record of being a well-run council financially that's enabling us actually to tackle a very difficult situation.
Thank you. Thanks for that. It's reassuring. Councillor Levery wants to come in now.
I did indeed say that the reserves policy shows that the officers are running our finances extremely well. Thank you.
Thank you for confirming that. And given the cuts, can we be reassured that we can deliver them next year? That's
There's an enormous amount of work to do, Chair. We recognise the risk of trying to deliver £52.7 million worth of savings in an organisation that's had 10 years, 12 years of cuts applied to it, as Dave has set out. That's one of the reasons, and back to having a good level of reserves that allows us to proceed carefully. It's one of the reasons why we're setting £25 million of reserves aside against the risk of being able to deliver all those savings in time. It's a heck of an ask. There's no other way of describing it. It's a huge number to deliver in very difficult circumstances.
absolutely. And I think that we've got very good officers here, and I'm sorry that we're losing you, Dave, but we have. I know that you're prudent and you keep your eye on this, so it's reassuring to hear that. Councillor Lodge wants to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's really just a comment about the capital programme that's in there. Too often this sort of gets overlooked when we get to the budget because we all just focus on the revenue and sort of head in hands and look how desperate it is. But there's some fantastic work that's been put in over years on this, and I don't think it gets enough recognition that goes in there, because in spite of everything in there, we're still seeing the investment that's going on across the city. I think the work that's been put in to develop this strategy for the years, and for the ambition for the years ahead, is great, really. And it sets us out, and it sets us on a clear path of what we hope we can do, and what we intend to do. We have to find the finances for it. You're dipping out, Dave, at the right time, aren't you? Before it gets really difficult with that. But I think, you know, it shows the ambition, and there's a lot of great things in there, and it recognises the challenges that are facing the city. It's recognising the need about housing investment. It's recognising the challenges around the environmental climate change and the environment emergency, and everything we need to do there. And it's, you know, it also reflects on some of the good things that we have done, and some of the things over the years that we've achieved and have gone now, but they are paying the dividends in helping us towards the revenue budget. And there are a lot of things in here which will help us in achieving a balanced revenue budget going forward by that investment in some of the assets of the council. And I think it's something that does get overlooked, really, and it is a huge programme, the investment there. I just want to thank officers for the work they're doing putting this together.
Thank you, Councillor Lodge. I think that's all the questions now, so I'd like to thank you again for coming along today. Eugene, you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment. We said it already, but I just want to kind of publicly state my, you know, thanks, but I'm sure you will, Dave, who is retiring now after years of sterling service and making a great contribution to keeping us on the straight and narrow. I just would like to add, he mentioned the 3 billion figure that Clive quoted as the cumulative cuts, and we know that figure's right because Dave actually gave it to him, by the way. So thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that, Eugene. And this report is to be noted, of course, and it's going to go to the co-op executive next week, I think, I gather. Councillor Rooney wants to make a comment.
It's going to be a proper cheerio, because this seems a little bit sort of flat. You know, I mean, are we going to say goodbye to you properly? COVID restrictions. COVID restrictions, as far as I am aware, have been lifted. So says Boris. Seriousness, if this is going to be your last meeting, David, I think we really ought to sort of mark it with a round of applause or something of that nature. Throw something at him.
We're still being webcast, so let's finish our meeting. All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming along today, and obviously this is noted and passed on to the co-op. I think we've all had our say today, and you've got a mammoth task, and thank you very much for attending today and explaining it all in detail. Thank you, Councillor MacDonald, too, for coming along and giving your answers. You can now leave, because we'll move on to our next part in the agenda. Which is item 8, draft work programme. And we just seem to be left with 2 meetings, which is one on the 24th of February for the Equalities. Councillor Argentio is indicating.
Yeah, could you clarify the date? Because at the front of the agenda it says 17th, but I thought we changed it and I just panicked when I saw that.
Yeah, I'll just clarify that. What we added another meeting, if you remember, at the last scrutiny board. We had to make room for the calling. Do you remember? So we had to move the equalities report forward. So we couldn't have it today because of the budget. So we've got the equalities report on the 24th of February, and then we've got the the last one on the 17th of March, which is the community safety. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is that all right with everybody? Right then. Thank you for your attendance and your prompt questions, so we've been able to finish before 3 o'clock. Thank you very much.